They warned us about the unpredictability of winter in the mountains, but we didn't think much of it. After weeks of planning, I was ready for a peaceful winter hike to clear my mind. And my friends, Lydia and Owen, seemed just as eager to escape. By midday, we were hiking along the narrow forest path, snowflakes dusting the branches, making everything look soft and untouched. The trees were thick, tall, and bare, more imposing than the last time we'd been up here. An hour in, the clouds thickened, and the wind started to pick up. A gentle snowfall turned fierce, the flakes larger and heavier, swirling around us like we were inside a snow globe. Lydia glanced at the sky, frowning. "This was supposed to be light snow," she muttered. It wasn't long before the snow came down in waves, blurring the landscape until the path behind us vanished completely. Everything around us became white and disorienting. Owen laughed nervously. "Should we turn back?" "Turn back where?" I replied, trying to hide my own worry. Every direction looked the same, and the snowfall grew thick and unyielding, making it impossible to find our way. Just as panic began to set in, I spotted a dark shape in the distance, a cabin, almost hidden beneath the snow, with a sagging roof and smoke rising faintly from the chimney. "Let's just wait out the storm there," I said, already trudging toward it, my relief outweighing the odd feeling curling in my stomach. The cabin loomed in front of us as we approached, old and worn, as if it had been standing here for centuries. Snow had piled up along its walls, making it seem smaller and more isolated. I reached out for the iron door handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open at my touch, as though it was inviting us inside. Once in, I took a deep breath. The air was stale and cold, carrying a faint, sour scent. The place looked abandoned, a single room with bare essentials: a fireplace with a low crackling fire, a rocking chair, and a small table coated in dust. Even the walls looked tired and worn, with dark wood paneling that made the room feel smaller. We closed the door against the storm, and I felt some of the tension ease, even if the air was still cold. I tossed a log onto the fire, the flames flaring up slightly and casting strange shadows across the room. Lydia and Owen sat near the fire, looking around cautiously. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of peace, but something about the cabin kept me uneasy, like it was holding its breath, waiting. That's when we heard the first noise. A faint, rhythmic tapping, soft but unmistakable. It came from somewhere above us, moving slowly from one end of the room to the other. I tried to ignore it, but Owen shifted nervously, glancing up at the ceiling. "Probably just a loose branch," I said, my voice barely convincing. The tapping grew louder, moving in a steady rhythm across the ceiling beams, then stopped, just as suddenly as it had begun. The room fell silent again, the quiet so thick it was almost suffocating. We sat in that uneasy stillness, each of us on edge, listening for any sign of another sound. But then, from the other side of the room, there was a heavy thump, as if something had dropped from above. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the far corner of the room, illuminating the rocking chair, which was slowly moving back and forth. Did that chair just move on its own?" Lydia whispered, eyes wide. "Maybe it's just the wind," I muttered, though my gut was telling me otherwise. The chair continued to rock for another few seconds, then stilled, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Tried to settle in again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I forced myself to focus on the fire, the warmth and light of it comforting. But then came another noise, a scraping sound, this time from the window beside us. I turned to look, and my heart skipped a beat. There, pressed against the frost-covered glass, was the outline of a long, thin hand. The hand dragged slowly down the window, leaving a faint trail in the frost, like someone or something was trying to find a way inside. I felt my blood turn to ice, and from the look on Lydia's face, I knew she'd seen it too. Her hand gripped mine, cold and trembling. "We should leave," she whispered, barely able to speak. I nodded, pulling her up as I moved toward the door. But when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but the wood felt like it had fused shut, trapping us inside. Owen joined me, pounding on the door, his voice rising in panic as he shouted into the void outside. The fire, which had been warm and steady, began to flicker, the flames shrinking until they were barely aglow. Shadows thickened around us, clinging to the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that defied reason. Then came a new sound, whispering. It was faint, barely more than a murmur, but it filled the room with a sense of dread. Each word cold and sharp, almost like a warning. The language was unfamiliar, broken and ancient, each syllable pressing down on us like a weight. Owen looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. What do they want? I couldn't answer. The shadows began to move, sliding along the walls, inching closer. Lydia backed against the wall, her breathing shallow and panicked. She was barely able to keep herself from screaming as the frost began to creep up from the floor, spreading toward her legs like ivy, and then it touched her. She gasped as the frost crawled up her body, covering her skin in a thin, crystalline layer. Her face contorted in horror as she tried to speak, but the frost sealed her lips, freezing her in a silent scream. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and pleading, as the ice spread over her face, encasing her completely. I stumbled back, watching in horror as she became a statue of ice, her expression forever trapped in fear. Owen screamed, backing away from the frozen figure that had been our friend just moments ago. The shadows moved toward him next, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. He thrashed, his voice rising in terror as he tried to free himself, but the shadows held tight, dragging him into the darkness. I was the last one left, my heart pounding as the frost crept closer, inch by inch. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out every other thought. I backed against the wall, desperate, but the cold was relentless, crawling up my legs, freezing me in place. I could barely move as the ice climbed higher, biting into my skin, numbing me. And then, just before the frost claimed me, I understood. We weren't the first to be trapped here, and we wouldn't be the last. The cabin was a place that held on to its visitors, adding them to its frozen collection, one by one. As the last of my warmth faded, I could still hear the whispers, welcoming me to an eternal winter the frost's embrace. The snow had started falling early that year, blanketing the little mountain town of Blackwood in thick layers of white. As the holidays approached, nearly every house was filled with light and warmth, except one. The old Harrow place, nestled at the edge of the woods, surrounded by rumors and half-forgotten tales. I hadn't planned on going there. I hadn't planned on any of it, really. I was only supposed to be in Blackwood for a few days to help my grandmother after her surgery, but she had insisted on telling me about the legend of the Harrow place. How, during a particularly brutal winter decades ago, every member of the Harrow family had vanished without a trace. Some claimed the cold had taken them. Others said it was madness from isolation. The townsfolk kept their distance, and as the years passed, the snow reclaimed the house, swallowing it up. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of it. I wasn't superstitious, but something in the way Grandma had spoken about the place got under my skin. So, bundled in my coat and gloves, I went out into the night, following a narrow path through the woods. The air was silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath. I found the house sooner than I'd expected, half buried in snow and cloaked in shadow. It stood, barely visible against the darkened woods, a gray husk with peeling paint and broken windows. Everything about it felt wrong, but there was something magnetic about it, like it was calling me closer. Steeling myself, I climbed the steps, wincing as they creaked underfoot, and pushed open the front door. The smell hit me first, the damp, musty scent, laced with something sour. The air inside was stale, thick, and cold. Snow had drifted in through the broken windows, covering the floor in a thin layer of ice crystals that crunched under my boots. As I stepped inside, I felt an almost physical weight press down on me. The rooms were empty, but something about them felt occupied. There was no furniture, no decorations, only the faint remnants of what had once been a home. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and stretching as though they had a life of their own. Then, the door shut behind me. The silence was so deep it seemed to pulse, pressing against my ears. I glanced back, feeling a sudden, irrational fear that I was no longer alone. But there was nothing there, just the same empty room, the silence thickening around me. Ignoring the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, I took a few steps further inside. The walls seemed to close in, the air colder than it had been outside. I felt the frost creeping under my gloves, biting at my skin. As I moved down the hall, my footsteps sounded oddly muffled, like the snow was swallowing the sound. I passed empty doorways that led into darkened rooms, each one filled with shadows that felt strangely solid. Then I heard it, a faint scratching, somewhere deeper in the house. I froze, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, a soft, relentless scrape, like nails dragging across wood. My stomach turned, but I couldn't shake the need to know what was making that sound. I followed the noise, each step slower than the last, my breath clouding the frigid air. The scratching was coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. As I got closer, I could see faint marks on the door's surface long, jagged scratches that looked fresh, as if something had been clawing to get out. I reached for the door handle, hesitating only a moment before turning it. Inside was a small, dark room, its only window coated in frost. The walls were bare, except for one detail, a large, circular mirror mounted across from the door. The glass was covered in frost, with only a small, clear patch in the center. I stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop even further. The scratching had stopped, leaving a suffocating silence. I stepped closer to the mirror, drawn by a strange compulsion to see my own reflection. But as I peered into the glass, I realized something was wrong. The reflection showed the room perfectly. Its frosted window, bare walls, the snow-crusted floor. But there was another figure in the mirror, standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Heart pounding, I looked back into the mirror, and there it was, again a figure, shrouded in shadow, standing just behind my shoulder. Its face blurred and indistinct, but eyes piercingly clear. They were hollow, dark, yet they seemed to see right through me. Before I could react, the figure began to move in the reflection, reaching out toward my shoulder. I felt an icy touch brush against my arm. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, breaking eye contact with the mirror. The room felt even colder now, and a deep guttural whisper filled the air, though I couldn't make out any words. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The scratching started again, louder and more frantic this time, as though whatever was behind that mirror was desperate to escape. I turned to run, only to find the hallway stretching endlessly before me. The house seemed to twist and shift around me, each doorway leading to another hall, each corner turning back on itself. The air was colder than I'd ever felt, biting through my clothes as frost began to creep up the walls, spreading faster with every second. I don't know how long I wandered, stumbling through that endless maze of dark hallways, the scratching always close behind me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and every now and then, I caught glimpses of that figure from the mirror, watching me from around corners or just out of reach. Finally, I found myself back in the front room, the door within sight. Relief flooded through me as I lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't open. I pounded against the wood, shouting, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. Then, I heard it, a faint, ghostly whisper. It filled the room, overlapping in layers, echoing against the walls. I could feel the presence behind me, closing in, its breath cold against my neck. I pressed harder against the door, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. The air turned icy, and frost began to creep over my hands, my skin burning as the cold took hold. I looked down, horrified to see my fingers turning blue, frozen in place. My breath came out in frantic clouds, but the whispers only grew louder, drowning out my own voice. And then, just as I felt myself slipping into the cold, the door swung open. I stumbled outside, falling into the snow, the warmth of the world flooding back. I lay there, gasping, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I looked back at the house, and for just a moment, I saw a face staring back at me through the frost-covered window. The same hollow eyes, watching, waiting. I stumbled away, never looking back. But as I reached the edge of the woods, I heard the faint scratching sound begin again.